Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. In this week's Torah reading, the Israelites are described as stiff-necked and rebels. They are warned not to attribute their success to their own power and commanded to bless God even when they are full. Finally, they are told that all God wants from them is yirah, translated variously as fear, awe, or wonder. Today we explore the power of disposition and attitude in Jewish thought. So welcome to Attitude is Everything. Well, welcome back, Rabbi, from the holy city of Beersheba. It's great to have you back.
And it's nice to be back in New York, and I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight about Eiken.
Absolutely. And it's next week, we're going to do it at 12 because you're going to be in Paris. So
I am. So we'll see whether we can put a little bit of French Jewish history into it next week.
You should be called the traveling rabbi. But anyway, we are all traveling one portion at a time. And this week we are in the portion of Akev. And as I referred to, it has a lot in it. But towards the end, it says, "And now, O Israel," in Deuteronomy 10:12, "what does your God demand of you? Only this, to revere your God, to walk only in divine paths, to love and to serve your God with all your heart and soul." And the fear your God is ki im liyira et Hashem Elokecha. And so, this kind of reminds you of these great closing lines. I'm thinking of Micha, but where the prophets really end up saying, and this is it all in a nutshell. And the rabbis took something profound from this verse. In the Talmud, Brachot 33b, it says, Rabbi Hanina said, "Everything is in the hands of heaven except for fear of heaven. Hakol biyadei shemayim chutz meyirat shemayim." Man has free will to serve God or not, as it is stated. And he quotes our verse, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you other than to fear the Lord?" So why don't we stop right here? We're going to have a great discussion about orientation and disposition, and we're going to touch upon all of those other verses that talk about maybe the characteristics of the Jewish people. But let's stop here for a second and just talk about Yirat Shemayim. It's a very basic term. You introduce religious parents or a friend to a friend, and you go, he's a real Yirat Shemayim. It's kind of the tagline for a religious, observant personality. What does Yirat Shemayim actually mean? Is it fear and trepidation?
It's a good question. I like to translate it as awe. What does awe mean? If you meet, I don't know, if you're a basketball fan and you meet LeBron James, you're not afraid of LeBron James, but you're in awe of LeBron James. That's the way we're supposed to think of God. We need to be in awe of God. Now, there is some fear because God has the ability to punish. But if you're in awe of God, then you behave in a certain way. Like if you're in the presence of the Queen of England, you're going to behave in a certain way because you're in awe of the Queen of England. So I prefer the word awe to fear.
So you mentioned about fear of punishment, and I think if you start to look at the traditional texts, you start to sense this tension between fear of outcomes and fear of God. So in Pirkei Avot, it says, Antigonus, a man of Socho, received the tradition, and he used to say, "Do not be like servants who serve the master in the expectation of receiving a reward, but be like servants who serve the master without the expectation of receiving a reward. And let the fear of heaven be upon you. Vayehi mora shamayim aleichem." So here it's almost in a positive sense, rather than fear of of punishment. It's looking for reward. But they seem to be all tied together. And you can't but ignore this concept that I always heard in the yeshiva, which is do something for its own sake. Do it lishma. What is the tension here?
Well, you bring up the idea of doing it for its own sake. See, you also said this is what you learned in the yeshiva. You know, Hasidim and what you call the yeshiva people had a big dispute. Hasidim thought that you should do things because they get you closer to God. You know, there's a dispute about what time to daven, to pray in the morning. Yeshiva people like to pray early because that's when the time the rabbis say that's the proper time to pray. Hasidim, if you ever went to a Chabad shul, you know, they start at 10 o'clock in the morning because they believe that it's more important to pray in a way that'll get you closer to God. And the way that'll get you closer to God is if you get to sleep late, then you'll be able to pray and get closer to God. So the idea of why you do something, are you afraid of punishment? Do you want to get closer to God? Or is it just lishma, just because, is actually a fascinating discussion.
So I went to, I would consider Torah V'Das a Hasidic yeshiva. And so the explanation I heard for why the Hasidim can start services even after the prescribed time of saying the Shema, they say if you go to a restaurant and the food is mediocre, it better be served fast and on time. But if you go to a 5-star restaurant, you'll excuse them if it's a little late. So that was the explanation.
That's funny. That's what they told you?
That's what they told me. So it was the quality of the prayers, too. But I totally agree. This is a tension between, I wouldn't say quality and quantity, but certainly when you talk about fear of God, it brings up this dialectic between what exactly are you afraid of and what is your motivation. So Maimonides, on his commentary on the Pirkei Avot that I just quoted, he kind of gets into this tension too, and he says, and nonetheless, he did not exempt us from fear of God. So he talks about how important it is to be serving God not for reward. And he said, even as you serve from love, do not discard fear completely. And may the fear of heaven be upon you. Serve from love, serve from fear. He quotes the Talmud in Barachot. And then he adds, he says, you know, love is a great pathway for the positive commandments, and fear is a great pathway for the negative commandments, and all the more so for the irrational commandments. So again, I think there's this sense that even though our text in our pasuk that we just quoted seems to imply, or at least the rabbis took it this way, because if you read the whole verse, it says, you know, revere God, and then it says walk in his pathways, love to serve your God with all your heart and soul. The trend, the thread that we're following tonight focused almost in isolation on this concept of fear. And the commentaries seem to try to, square it with all the other intentions that are so important. And it almost comes out to be a backstop. And that's why tangentially this Antigonos Isochno said, do it for the right reason, do it for the right reasons, but never give up on fear. So it almost seems like a default, a plan B. If everything else fails, there's always fear.
Well, let's go back to the pasuk that you quoted. It says, what does God ask from you? He only asks fear. So actually, that's what I think they're playing on. Why is it that he only asks fear? What about everything else? God doesn't ask you to fast on Yom Kippur. God doesn't ask you to keep the Shabbat. God doesn't ask you to keep kosher. What do you mean all God asks you is for fear of God? So the rabbis say everything's in heaven's hand except for fear. But that's kind of a weak answer. I mean, why is fear? I think that's what we have to talk about. Why is fear qualitatively different than everything else.
So I love your focus, and I think really for the rest of our discussion, we are going to discuss the only, the total laser focus on this disposition. But before we do, I would like to bring this yirah up into the more present, and I do want to say, because we're going to be discussing this concept of a disposition, of an attitude as being so singular, I do want to bring Heschel into it. And Heschel writes in God in Search of Man, he says, what is the nature of yirah? The word has two meanings, fear and awe. There is the man who fears the Lord lest he be punished in his body, family, or in his possessions. Another man fears the Lord because he is afraid of punishment in the life to come. Both types are considered inferior in Jewish tradition. Fear is the anticipation and expectation of evil or pain contrasted with hope, which is the anticipation of good. Or, on the other hand, is the sense of wonder and humility inspired by the sublime or felt in the presence of mystery. So we're going to talk a lot about this isolated disposition, but clearly I don't think we need to be cornered into talking about fear, certainly not fear of punishment. I love, you said you think of it as awe. I love even going a step further with Heschel to wonder. And of course, he wrote a whole book on All I Ask For Is Wonder, which is actually a restatement of what only God asks from us. So I love this wonder. And I think if I bring anything, and maybe the two of us, if we bring everything every week, it's reading the verses again and thinking about it with an element of wonder.
I mean, it's so great that really what we're talking about here is just the definition of one word, which is yirah. And it's awe, and it's wonder, and it's fear, and it's all of the above. But isn't it so interesting how we're looking for the right English word?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's get back to this concept of intentionality and attitude and disposition. Once I focused on this first, then I reread the portion, and I couldn't help, and I said this in the intro, notice that, for instance, in Deuteronomy 8, where God is kind of bringing back the whole history of the travels in the desert, and he said, and when you get to the land, and when things start to look good, do not say to yourselves, my own power and the might of my own hand have won this wealth for me. The Hebrew is kochi v'otzem yadai. And it's, for those of you who know Hebrew, certainly Rabbinic Hebrew, that's a catchphrase. That's a phrase for, again, a disposition of someone who feels that the good that he has is because of his doing, his merit, and that again, it's the opposite of hakarat hatov, of recognizing that we are just a small little pot, and anything good that happens to us, we should be thankful to God, to others, to happenstance, to circumstance for, but certainly not proud. So it is a disposition, and it's a powerful one, is it not?
Very powerful. I mean, this idea is something that appeared in last week's parsha and something that appears again this week. And that's the idea of humility, right? Don't think that we're so great. And I saw somebody today gave the explanation that the reason Moses goes through a whole kind of narrative at the beginning of this week's parsha, saying, it was hard for you in the desert, and God took you out, and God took care of you, because what Moshe is most concerned about, when you think about it, the Jews had it pretty easy over 40 years. It took 40 years, but miraculously they survived, and they were victorious, and every battle they fought, they won. It's very easy to get to get haughty, to get arrogant based on that. And what Moshe says to them is, don't do that. Don't say kochiv otzem yadi. Realize that we need to be grateful to God and to one another for the fact that we are so successful.
The next very famous attitudinal characteristic is in Deuteronomy 9, where God says, I see that this is a stiff-necked people. V'hine am kashe'oref hu. It's not talking about something that an orthopedic surgeon can solve or a good massage can cure. This is, again, it's a disposition. It's God is really, through Moses, or Moses on his own, is really focused on the dispositions of the people. And in these particular two first instances, they're not all that positive. But to say that someone's am kashe oref is, again, it appears throughout the Bible, does it not?
All the time. That is a description of the Jews, a stiff-necked people, a stubborn people. Now, stubborn and ungrateful are not exactly the same thing. I think that's important. They're not the same thing, right? They're two different criticisms.
And I think that's why it's so important. This is not a broken record today. I mean, the narrative, the soliloquy by Moses is focused on different negative dispositions, orientations, attitudes of the people that come up so often that you've got to recognize them, and they're different. And then the third one is in Deuteronomy 9:24, and it says, "As long as I have known you, you have been defiant toward God. Mamrim hayitem." So, again, this is slightly different than just stiff-necked. Stiff-necked is stubborn. It's different than kochim v'yotzim yodai, which is have ingratitude and to very quickly think that the world operates at your bequest. These are three. I love that you pointed out that they're different because they are, I think, intentionally different.
I think that's right. I mean, Moses is, there are a lot of things, Moses is trying to say a lot of different things, and they're variations on the same theme, because probably people who are stubborn are ungrateful. That's probably true. So they're related to one another, but they're not exactly the same thing. Moses is making a few different points. And mamrim hayitem, now the word mamrim, that they rebelled, right? Mei Meriva, the place where Moses hit the rock is called Mei Meriva. It's where you rebelled, right? That's what's so, the idea, again, if you're stubborn, you rebel. If you rebel, then you're ungrateful. They're all related ideas.
So I think that what this raises for us, especially if we end up at the only thing I ask for you is to have this disposition variously known as fear or wonder, is that unlike so many other places in the Torah, this particular parsha is absolutely laser focused on you've got to have the right disposition. Because if you have the wrong disposition, it doesn't matter how many of the commandments you keep and how many of the prohibitions you keep away from. You're not getting the message. And again, that gets back to what you focused on, which is the word only, rak. This is ki'im liyira et Hashem. This is the Holy Grail. So I ended up at a yeshiva in Israel called Be'er Yaakov. And the head of it was one of the last of the great Mussarniks. The Mussar movement, I might have mentioned it before, was started by Yisrael Salanter. And the whole focus was on understanding what Yirat Hashem is, understanding what the disposition is. And if you had to pick the textbook for the Mussar movement, it would have been the one written by a name that we've heard before, Latzato, but not Shmuel David Latzato, Shadal, but Moshe Chaim Latzato, the Ramchal, and it was called Mesilat Yesharim, which is the path of the just, and they were related. The Ramchal lived in the 1700s, and Shadal lived in the 1800s. They were cousins once removed. And what he did in this book, and I have the introduction or parts of the introduction in the notes on Sefaria, is he says, there are so many of us that study creation and nature. We study astronomy, mathematics. There are those of us who study the Holy Torah. Among those occupy themselves with halachic and analysis, others with midrash. He says, but there are few who devote thought to the study of fear, clinging, and other branches of piety. And then he goes on to say, and most of us who are educated think of those who have a focus on fear as almost superstitious. They're saying psalms over and over again. They're holding their prayer beads or twiddling their prayer shawls. And he really created a revolution in the sense that he wanted to focus in a laser-like fashion in trying to understand we truly examine the matter, we would discover the truth and benefit ourselves. He quotes Shlomo, King Solomon, and it says, if you will seek it as silver and search for it as buried treasure, then you will understand the fear of God. And he ends by saying, and I'll end quoting from him here, why shouldn't a man set aside for himself at least fixed times for this study if he is forced for the rest of his time to turn to other studies or affairs? So what happened in the Mussar Yeshiva, we were talking in the pregame about your study partner at high school. The most unique thing about studying Mussar for half an hour a day in a Mussar Yeshiva is you don't do it with a study partner. You do it totally alone. And you read these books and you try to understand what is this disposition. And it really focuses on everything that we've been talking about till now, which is, yes, there's fear of punishment, and yes, there's fear that protects you from doing wrong and the bad things. But at the crux of it is, what is this only thing that we have? And I just find that so fascinating.
That is absolutely fascinating. And it's interesting you bring in the Mussar Yeshiva. You know, in today's world, you said you went to the last Mussar Yeshiva. What's happened now is that everything has kind of been put together like a stew, like a cholent. The Hasidim are with the non-Hasidim. The Mussar is with the non-Mussar. There's a little bit of everything. So that idea of Mussar, that idea is what is fear of God. It's still there. People still learn Mesilas Yesharim, which is an interesting thing. And, you know, what he says in Mesilas Yesharim in the introduction that you quote is that this world is like an entryway to the world to come. That the whole purpose of this world is to get us ready for the world to come. So the purpose of this world is to fear God so that we can be ready for the world to come. That's it's all God-centered. That idea that we're focused on the world to come means that everything is God-centered. It's a very interesting notion, which really is found in the Mussar movement, but you don't find it in traditional Jewish literature.
So the only thing that I would, kind of try to at least parse slightly differently is, because you can translate fear as awe and as wonder. What strikes me is, and doesn't have to apply to the world to come, a world of punishment or reward. It just strikes me that what the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, was trying to do was trying to, in a sense, create an interpretation or an outcome from our verse. If all that God asks of us is to fear Him, then what is this? Or I say to hold Him in awe, or to have this disposition of wonder, then shouldn't we kind of focus on it a little more? And to me, what is fascinating is less the content of, or the answers to that question, as it is the focus in the question itself, this laser-like focus on the disposition. And I think the thinker that I'm going to bring in now, I'm not sure he has ever been brought up in the same breath as Yisrael Salanter. But I'm talking now about a psychologist named Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And what he said in that is, yes, the primary motivational force for an individual is finding meaning in life. He found that if you had meaning, your chances of surviving were better. It didn't matter if you were communist or a Bundist or a chassid. As long as you had something to hold on to, you could find a reason to survive. But, he went further and he says life has meaning under all circumstances, even the most miserable ones. And that, I guess, is baked into that. But then he goes one step further. We have freedom to find meaning in what we do and what we experience, or at least in the stance we take when faced with a situation of unchangeable suffering. What he said is basically that the most evil empire in the world could take anything away from you, but it can't take away from you your will to life or your will for meaning. And so what he took away from his interpretation, I believe, of the only thing you have is Yirat Hashem, awe of God, mystery of God, is the only thing you have is attitude. And that's why I named this week's session, Attitude is Everything. You can take anything away from anybody, but not your attitude. And I think if you look then backwards, I really do believe you can start connecting the dots in the sense of not whether this person was religious or a philosopher or whatever, but ultimately at the end of the day, what God could be or Moses could be interpreting, saying here is, you know what? At the end of the day, all you got is your attitude. Am I making too big of a leap here?
I love it. So I love it. So let's just take it, let's parse it, as you said. Viktor Frankl says no one can take away your meaning, your self-definition of what's important to you. And obviously, to a religious person, that meaning is awe of God. It doesn't have to mean that. I don't know if it meant that to Frankl, but the point is that it could mean that. To people who are religious, they define their religion as awe of God. So therefore, they would apply what Frankl said, and they would say, that's right. You can't take away my awe of God. It's related, since Frankl lived through the Holocaust and he was talking about the Holocaust, it's related to the people who went to the gas chambers with, saying Shema Yisrael or saying Ani Mamid. They wanted to show that you can take away everything from me, even my life. But you can't take away, the meaning. You can't take away the Ani Mamid, and you can't take away the Shema, which is exactly what Frankl meant.
Absolutely. And as a psychologist, the other paradigm shift that you see is he was less focused on what was out there and more focused was what is in here, meaning in your mind. And I think that too is an unbroken connect your dot type of trail back through the Musaniks, back through the Talmud that says all you have is Yirat Hashem, that the ultimate thing is that it's in your mind. And because it's in your mind, you are the creator of it, and you can almost look at that verse, at the rabbis saying, Hakol biyadei Shemayim chutz meyirat Shemayim, we haven't really focused on that so much, which is to say almost like God can do anything. God can predict anything. God can control anything. But God has a singular limitation. He cannot control what's in your mind. And that aspect of it, I think, to me, is the mirror image of a Frankl saying that it is truly in your mind, and because it's in your mind, it cannot be in any way diminished by outside circumstances. And I think it's a total trail.
So I love it. I would just change the smallest little thing. You know what I would say? What I would say is, I don't know that God can't do it. Maybe God doesn't want to do it. Maybe the meaning, your meaning, needs to be defined by yourself. And that's exactly what the Torah says, that everything's in the hand of God except for fear of God. That's God's choice. We believe that God can do anything, but God chooses not to do that. Isn't that interesting?
I think so, and I think you would probably agree with me at the end of the day that we might be splitting hairs.
Right, I'm sure we are. But since you brought up
Yeah.
Frankel,
Yeah.
I want to kind of fit Frankel in. Now, he wasn't intending to be fit. He wasn't thinking that he was going to be brought up in the parsha class on the parsha of Akev. But it's interesting to think about him because Jewish thought is Jewish thought. And if he gives us some insight into what the rabbis mean, then that's valuable.
So I'll finish with one insight I had sitting in my first introductory to philosophy class. And the founder of modern philosophy is many times thought of as Rene Descartes, who started Cartesian philosophy, which is, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. And what he said, sitting in his room, is how does he know anything is actually out there? And I can't do justice to that in 2 minutes, but you can understand how it was all in the mind, and so philosophy almost becomes the study of the mind. But what he based it on was a theologian 100 years, 200 years earlier named St. Anselm. And St. Anselm says, you can't imagine 2 + 2 = 5. So not everything that you can imagine can be true, but you can imagine God. We have this concept of God. And God is a being of which there is nothing greater. So what is greater, an imaginary God or a real God? And you can look at the notes, you can spend years studying this, whether it was a good proof or not a good proof. But my point is that the ontological proof for God made by St. Anselm said ultimately it's all in your mind, and it's all your attitude. And I think that is where you and I are maybe splitting hairs, because at the end of the day, it's the God that we imagine and the imagination that God gives us. And we do have these dispositions. Some of them are good, and some of them are great, and some of them are not so good. But I think what this week's parsha makes us focus on is those things that only we have and that are not in the hand of God. And those are our thoughts and our dispositions. And it's a powerful poem to the power of our own self-realization.
I love it. I think this is a great, this idea and Frankel and the idea of fear of God are putting together a lot of things very much in the spirit of what Moshe tried to do in the parsha of Akev. So thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Looking forward to seeing you all next week from Paris. Be well and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. But I'll see you all next week. And make sure you listen to us on the podcast. And if you like it, give us a review or a star and share it with your friends. So with that, I wish you a great Parshat Akev, Shabbat Mevorachim, and I'll see you all next week.